Well, I haven't actually posted anything for quite a while, so you might be wondering what I've been up to. Maybe, maybe not, I don't know. Well, apart from the interruption of Christmas and New Year, which is always a bit hectic, what I've actually been working on for the last, I don't know, 3 weeks, I guess, something in that order, is working on 4 extra surround loudspeakers to convert my monitoring arrangement so that I can actually have a 5.1.2 setup, i.e. sort of ATMOS type setup where you have elevation channels. And also, although I've currently got a 5.1 setup available to me, the 0.1, I mean not the 0.1, I don't actually have a 0.1 because I use my monitors for the 0.1 because they extend down to 27 Hertz, so I have no need for a subwoofer. Similarly, it's not really a 5.1 in the actual speaker configuration. It's a effectively 4.0, but because of the way it's channeled through a receiver, it's still 5.1 sound. It just means that I don't have a center channel and I don't have a subwoofer, and both of those channels are being taken care of by my main monitors. The reason why I don't need a center channel, one, they're a pain in the ass anyway because they're right in the middle where you want to have your monitor, so they take up space. And I, in my listening environment, have a very stable and solid phantom image in the middle of the 2 speakers, so adding a center channel wouldn't do anything to my system in terms of sound reproduction quality. But anyway, so going back to the 5.1, another reason for actually creating new monitors, surround monitors to go with my main monitors, is because the actual timbre of the surround monitors that I currently use, which are basically, I don't know, 90s vintage Mission bookshelf speakers. I can actually show you what it looks like. It's basically, well, hang on. Get my camera monitor around the right way. It's basically this. They're pretty small, but yeah, the timbre of that does not match my main monitors. They're rather weak on the mid-range, which is quite common for two-way loudspeaker systems. I have compensated for that to some extent using just the equalization functionality available on my receiver, which works quite well, but it would be far superior to having actual monitors that actually matched the response. So if you want to, I can actually talk about that whole process of just looking for various stuff, creating that. But I suppose before I do that, it'd probably be worth discussing the salient features of my main monitors before I discuss what I did with the surround monitors that I'm in the process of constructing. I've actually completed the assembly of 3 of them, 3 out of 4. So I'll have 2 rear channel ones and 2 ceiling channel ones and my main monitors. I also have a new receiver because my original Yamaha entry-level receiver that I bought to dabble in surround sound was only a 6-channel receiver, and I need an 8-channel receiver to be able to do 5.1.2. So I've got a new one of those, which I haven't yet installed. But if we go on to I'm just taking the cover off my existing monitors. Go on to a discussion of what monitors I actually use, which again are of my own design, and I guess I designed and built them maybe 2013, something like that. Found a few issues with my original design, which I fixed up maybe in 2015 or so, mainly just not accounting for the baffle step issue properly. But now they're pretty much as close to perfect as I'd like, but I shall now discuss that. So here we go. I'll keep it upright. So that is basically, I'll stand back so you can see the whole thing. That is basically one of the floor standing full range loudspeaker monitors that I have. Probably stands about, about 1.2 meters tall, I think, something like that. The internal volume for the woofer and the sound port is around about 70 litres, if I remember correctly, and then there's probably another 5 litre internal volume for the upper woofer mid-range. What's unusual about this, I'll keep it upright. What's unusual about this particular design compared with most conventional designs is how the spectrum is divided up and what proportion is taken by which drivers. So the easiest way to describe my monitors is essentially two-way with subwoofer, because the crossover point between the woofer mid-range and the tweeter is 1 kilohertz. That's very low typically for a two-way loudspeaker system. The reason why I chose that is because directionality effects cut in quite early on the woofer driver in a typical two-way loudspeaker system. Not so much in this design because there's only 5 inches, but when you get in at the typical sort of monitors, that active monitors that get used in home studios are usually around about 8 inches. They will start getting directional quite early, probably around about 500 hertz, which means you end up with this mid-range weakness due to the fact that the polar response above that becomes quite directional. So, and what you actually hear in your studio environment is both the direct sound and reflected sound. And the reflected sound is going to be coloured by the fact that the polar response of your loudspeakers is compromised. So the idea, obviously, there was to keep the crossover point between the mid-range, woofer mid-range in this case, and the tweeter as low as possible. And this particular biannual, if you have a look, I think the driving coil is in between those two annular rings. It's a XTG25 or something like that, from woofer, a Danish loudspeaker manufacturer. It's a very good tweeter, but it has venting of the driver cone to the back through the magnet, which gives it a very low, for a tweeter anyhow, a very low natural resonant frequency. The natural resonant frequency of that tweeter is 400 hertz. And because of that low resonance, it means it's usable provided you have a steep enough crossover down to 1 kilohertz, which is what I've actually done. So I've got a third order, essentially a third order Butterworth crossover, as in, what would that be? 18 dB per octave cutoff slope. So basically, yeah, there'll be, by the time you get to the natural resonant frequency of the tweeter, you're talking the content that it sees from the amplifier is attenuated in the order of 20 dB. So it's obviously not going to, the problem of excessive cone excursion around resonance is not going to be an issue because it's 20 dB attenuated. And from my experience listening to it at the sort of levels that I listen to, it isn't an issue. So that's the salient feature between the woofer mid-range and the tweeter. But the next salient feature is that where the woofer mid-range and the actual woofer, or in this case it's essentially a subwoofer, gets crossed is 120 hertz, which is very low in most conventional three-way loudspeaker designs. Typically they're only on average crossed around 300 hertz or something like that. So, and curiously enough, if you actually just listen to, because again, that's a third order Butterworth cutoff slope between those two drivers. Electrically, it's not third order for the woofer mid-range because it's utilising the second order component in a Butterworth response implementation. It's actually utilising the cabinet enclosed resonance of the driver. So the cabinet volume was chosen to put that up to the appropriate level for that 120 hertz crossover. So it's a relatively small volume adding to the stiffness of the cone. So that's where you get the second order cutoff for that. But then additionally, you get a first order added to that through capacitive coupling to electrically to that driver, giving you the third order acoustic cutoff of this driver. And then this woofer is third order Butterworth electrically cut off with a low pass filter, obviously, that matches those two appropriately and is impedance equalized so that you don't get any non-conformity to the desired response because of not operating into a resistive load. What I was going to say, that if you actually just disconnected, I can't obviously do it now, but if you actually disconnected these two drivers and just listened to this, playing back some music, it's surprising that it just sounds like mud, basically. It's all the low end and nothing that's intelligible whatsoever. It's only once you add these two that it actually sounds complete. And the majority of the intelligible content to music is covered by just those two drivers. This is basically just acting as a subwoofer in essence, which has a design 3 dB cutoff of 27 Hertz, but in this relatively small room at a distance, it extends down to 27 Hertz because you get the lift from radiating into a confined space. Now, I've had criticism before when I talked about my design, my loudspeaker design, ages ago when I did it as a blog, by the fact that it has a vent in it, because there's this long-standing feud, I guess, between people who think that vents are okay and people who think that vents are the greatest sin on the earth because they provide resonance. But in the context of the way that I'm actually using this this woofer, and because of the way the crossover is structured, the typical thing that they complain about is a non-issue. Now, I suppose I'll probably need a whiteboard to actually explain this. Explain what's going on or what they complain about. I'm looking for lost my pen. There's my whiteboard. Where's my pen gone? What do I do with it? Jeez. Excuse me. Here it is. Found it. Okay. I'll just set it up here on the keyboard. Try to. I terminated that accidentally. So if we continue on with this, right. So cross-section of a typical vented loudspeaker system. You've got, okay, here's your cabinet. You've got your driver in here. You've got a vent here. So the fundamental complaint about the vented loudspeaker is that this tube has a natural pipe resonance. Like it, in terms of the actual cabinet design, the base extension's provided not as a pipe resonance, it's provided as a Helmholtz resonator, which basically means that this box provides stiffness, the pipe provides a mass, so it's a mass spring damper system. And that's true, that's a true approximation at lower frequencies. But as you get up into the higher frequencies, you'll get, like, the first pipe resonance for this will be a mode that goes like that in terms of amplitude. So it's essentially the first resonance is a half wavelength. So in my case, well, and so that's lambda on 2, basically, half wavelength. So in a typical loudspeaker design where your woofer is acting as a mid-range as well as a woofer, it means this pipe resonance actually typically lives in the same bandwidth as what this loudspeaker is producing, which can lead to this coloration and extension of a resonance in your overall response. But in my case, basically, this distance, this lambda on 2, it's approximately 15 centimeters. So it means the wavelength is around about 30 centimeters. Speed of sound is 340 or thereabouts meters per second, which means my first pipe resonance is going to be around about 1.2 kilohertz, right? But the point is, this woofer is not producing anything of significance at that frequency because it's crossed at 120 hertz, right? I.e. a decade, that's 1 decade, 10 times that is that. It's crossed at 120 hertz with a third order crossover, which gives a cutoff slope of 3 times 20 or 60 dB per decade, right? So it means any content from this going through that at the pipe resonance is already attenuated 60 dB. So that pipe resonance would have to be incredibly sharp in terms of Q to actually be audible. And given the geometry, basically if you want a high Q pipe resonance, you need a pipe with a big ratio between the length and the diameter, basically. So D. So L on D needs to be a large number. In my case, it's not, obviously, but it's not only that. It's because it's a fancy port. It's got rounded edges on the end as well. So that means it's going to be a pretty low Q resonance. I doubt if it's any higher than 6 dB. It's probably less. So it means at most, the resonance content coming from that port is going to be like 54 dB below the main level. You're not going to hear it. Simple as that. I guess another explanation that I hear from people complaining about ports. Hang on. Yep. Another explanation I hear from people complaining about ports is that if you, for instance, just have guitar sitting in a room and you play music and you stop your music, you can hear the guitar strings vibrating. So that the port works exactly the same way. Well, no, the port doesn't work exactly the same way because the port is really low Q. Guitar strings are really high Q. Like guitar string resonance is probably going to have a Q of about 100 at least, I would imagine. Something of that order. So that's going to give a huge magnification. The easy way to demonstrate that is if you take your guitar that's sympathetically resonating with your music when you stop it, just wait for the moment when you actually change your strings. Leave the strings off and then see how much you can actually hear your guitar. Even if it's a acoustic guitar with a sound hole, you won't hear it. It's only because the strings are there that you hear it. And it's the strings that are giving that sympathetic resonance that makes it audible. So, yeah, that's basically my monitor design. It's a rather complicated crossover because although the crossover components just associated with the filtering are relatively simple, they're just third order Butterworth, you need a whole bunch of other stuff in there to actually make it work. Specifically, the two aspects. There's one aspect is impedance equalization, because all those Butterworth filters and things like that, filter design, they're basically designed to operate in a resistive load, not a reactive load. And loudspeakers are not a resistive load. They have a resonance, or one or two resonances peaks in them, depending on whether it's a sealed enclosure or a vented enclosure. So if you want your filter to actually behave itself, you need to make it look resistive. So you need a whole bunch of extra components in there to so-called equalize the impedance to make it look like it's a resistor rather than a complex load. And then there's one other aspect, and that is the phase alignment issues associated with the woofer mid-range and tweeter crossover point, which again I can demonstrate again. I shall do that. To explain that, let's have a look. Oh God, can't get the lid off with one hand. So if we got our, this is magnitude, this is frequency. If we've got our tweeter, idealized tweeter response that looks like this, this is a 12 dB per octave cutoff. And there's a resonance here. What actually happens in terms of the phase response, so this is phase, it's frequency, will be something like this. So that will be, it depends on which way. Well, 180 degrees, and that's 0, obviously. Actually, I probably got it inverted. It should be minus 180 degrees in that way. So basically, if I now try and put in, say my idealized mid-range response was that, and then I put in a cutoff there to try and, oh, actually, that's not right, because this is my free air resonance. I'm actually filtering it and cutting it off here, say. And then I've got this mid-range here, and I'm cutting it off here. You can see there's this massive phase anomaly here, because ideally the phase response of the mid-range will just be 0. And my Butterworth filter crossover assumes that the phase difference between the natural response of the mid-range and the tweeter is 0, basically, across the entire band. But because of the free air resonance of the tweeter, you get this phase anomaly. And if you don't deal with this phase anomaly, then you end up with a big hole in your response, your blended response, because suddenly you got this phase mismatch where there shouldn't be. So that's an issue that needs to be dealt with. And typically what you end up doing is you add what I have done is you add a all-pass lattice filter equalizer, which basically has a frequency response that looks like, has a magnitude response that is flat, that's magnitude, but it has a phase response that does the same thing, so basically does that. So you're basically making the phase response of the tweeter and mid-range match so that they actually work. So that's the other thing that you need. So if I look at the actual, just drop my lid. Here's a sketch of the actual crossover that I have in my, this is not the main monitors, but it's the same, it's a subset of what's in the main monitors, because this is the crossover that I'm actually using in my satellite monitors that I've actually created. So if you have a look here, you basically got that, and those two constitute a third order low pass filter. So that's cutting the high frequencies out of the woofer mid-range, which in the context of my surround speaker crossover is just a woofer, basically. Then you got all these other components associated with it. Basically, those two, that's just a equalization of the what do you call it? Self-inductance of the voice coil. Basically, the voice coil is like an inductor, so at high frequencies its impedance goes up and we want it to stay constant. So we have this resistor and capacitor in series which cancels that out. But similarly, yeah, that's right. But this here, these components form the lattice network that does the phase equalization. But not only does it do phase equalization, it also does baffle step compensation, because if you have a look, it's got a resistor in the capacitive arm and no resistor in the inductive arm, which basically means that at low frequencies it doesn't attenuate, but at high frequencies it does. So the actual response for that lattice in terms of a magnitude response is something like that. So it does give attenuation at high frequencies, and we need that attenuation at high frequencies because of the baffle step. What is the baffle step? It basically means that if you look at a typical recorded magnitude response of a driver published by the manufacturer, it shows the frequency response with a so-called infinite baffle, which is effectively like if you drilled a hole in your wall and mounted your speaker in the wall and then played it back through that. Because of that, it means the loudspeaker is actually radiating into a half space. So there's no opportunity for sound to go around behind the driver. And as such, it means you don't get a baffle step. But if you've got a loudspeaker system like this, you don't have an infinite baffle. It's only got a finite width. So at some point, the frequency, the directionality of the driver becomes such that, well, yeah, at some point the driver becomes directional, and at that point you don't get sound moving around behind the loudspeaker. But in the point where it's unidirectional, you do get sound moving around the side of the speaker. So essentially then you've gone from radiating into a half space into a full space. So that effectively halves the sound pressure level. So you end up getting like a 6 dB drop in sensitivity at low frequencies. So that's what the baffle step is. In the case of this driver, the baffle... Well, that was weird. My camera shut down, complaining it was too hot. Anyway, let it cool down for a bit and I'll try and continue and finish this video. So, yeah, I was saying that the baffle step, the compensation that I need in my crossover, it doesn't need the full 6 dB because the natural response of that driver is to have about 3 dB lower level in an infinite baffle frequency response test at higher frequencies. So I only need about 3 dB. So that's basically the purpose of those 1.5 ohm resistors. And that addition of that attenuation in the baffle step compensation in that phase equalization network results in a non-resistive impedance, which is what these two components compensate for to make it look resistive. So that's basically it. So you see a large proportion of what's on the woofer is basically just compensation components, not the actual filter. Similarly, in the tweeter case, these capacitors and that inductor is the third order high pass, third order high pass filter. This is level padding, basically to bring the level down to the right level for the woofer. And the remaining components, these are again just impedance equalization, so to make the load look resistive. So that's basically it. If you want to actually see what these things actually look like, well, actually, the other thing I didn't mention is there is this standoff here. That's actually basically to time align those two drivers, because the time center of this driver is delayed compared to that. So that's the point of that. Here's an unfinished cabinet. Or you can, if you look inside, you can see my rather complicated looking crossover. That's the entire thing in there. See? That's the hole for the tweeter, the hole for the woofer, hole for the connector at the back. That's a standoff. And here we have, if I can pick it up, a completed version. There you go. Looks very similar to the other, the woofer arrangement. Same sort of standoff, same drivers. The rear, you got connectors at the top. Still have to make covers for them. So I've made 3 of these. I've got another one there that I need to assemble. And that's pretty much it. That's what I've been up to. One other thing I could probably mention along with that is what I actually have in my system. Some of these components are pretty old, like these date back to the 90s. My G20 graphic equalizer, which you can see never gets used anymore, but it was useful in the early days when I didn't have access to spectrum analysis to do frequency response testing to do speaker designs, because I was into speaker designs back then, and this was useful to actually figure out level padding and crossover modifications. My old tape deck, again from the same vintage, barely ever gets used. This is my main stereo amp, which is just a Yamaha receiver, RX-497. Two channel, that's basically what I use to listen to all my CD music with. This is my 5.1 receiver. It's collecting dust. Entry level one, the 5-channel one, the RX-V6A, which is basically what I use for my 5.1 surround, but that's going to get replaced. And this is my, again, I don't know, this is slightly newer than these devices. This is probably a 2005 vintage DVD-C 740 Yamaha 5-disc player, changer, which I used to play my CDs on, which I've had to repair. I've had to repair that once. It had some stuffed capacitors in the power supply, which meant it wouldn't switch on. Similar story with this receiver as well. That had a power supply problem as well, but they're both functioning perfectly now again. And that's pretty much what I use. I've got a switch down here on the side, which allows me to switch outputs between the amplifiers for the main speaker, so I can go from my stereo to surround. And that's pretty much it. What else? Yeah. The other thing I would mention, I've seen a lot of comments from, I don't know, studio owners complaining about the old Dolby Atmos thing, people saying whatever. You have to spend, it's not worthwhile doing because you'd have to spend so much money on gear or whatever to support it in the studio. And that's because they're looking at it from the perspective of supporting it via using, say, active monitors and things like that. If you want to dabble in surround sound, that's not the way to go. The way to go is to use a commercial receiver like the Yamaha ones that I was talking about, because then all you need, you don't need multiple new, for instance, DACs or things like that, because you rely on the DAC in the receiver. People will probably bitch and say, "Oh, yeah, but the quality's not there." But you're talking about very minimal differences between a super high-end DAC and the DACs within receivers. You're talking second-order effects. It's a waste of time to even debate that sort of thing. So I don't see any reason why you cannot mix via one of those receivers and a good collection of loudspeakers. The other benefit of that is bass management, because receivers provide bass management, which if you're doing an ad hoc implementation via, I don't know, a multi-channel output device connected to a computer and multiple amplifiers and things like that, you don't get that bass management. You can't do it. Now, what do I mean by bass management? A receiver manages the bass output of your device. So, for instance, in my case, I've got two main monitors that are set up within the receiver to say that they're full range devices. They can cover the full range. And I've also set up in my receiver to say that I don't have a subwoofer. So what that means is any content that's in the LFE channel, you might think, oh, you don't have a subwoofer, you're not going to hear it. That's bullshit, because what happens is with the bass management, it takes that LFE channel It attenuates at the right level because, boosts at the right level because its LFE is 10 dB below normal. So it boosts it to the right level and then shoves it to my main monitors. So my main monitors will produce the LFE output. Similarly, if your surround devices aren't full range and you set up in your receiver to say that those surround channels are, say, small speakers, it'll put in a crossover for you, and any low frequency content of stuff that is going to those surround channels will get routed to the main monitors so that you still hear the low frequency content. And the reason why you can do it, there's the same reason why you can use a subwoofer. It's because low frequencies are pretty much omnidirectional. It doesn't matter. You can't hear the direction. So you can use small speakers for your surround and just have a stereo match pair for your main monitors and get the perfect response. Whereas if you were just doing that via, say, a DAW as an output with however many channels you need, like 8 channels for 5.1.2 or 10 channels for 7.1.2, you would have to do all that shit yourself. And you might not do it accurately as well, and you have to go through all the calibration shit. You use a receiver, it happens all by itself. Also, in terms of actual interfacing, it's trivial. It's just a HDMI cable. You just plug your HDMI cable into your computer. That goes into your receiver. Then you have the monitor out on the receiver going to your monitor, which is exactly what I've got here. You see, there's my monitor there. That's actually plugged into the computer. I guess there's a couple of other things I can actually show here as well, because I did some, that's why I've got this here. I did some frequency response testing of my surrounds that I just constructed. This was before having, like, the baffle was loose, so that's why you've got this resonance peak in here. The green is basically my satellite monitor, and the purple is my floor standing monitors. Pretty much match. That is loose because, I mean, that resonance there is because, if I show you here, this monitor, this front baffle was just a tight fit and it was just sitting inside my box. It wasn't actually glued in place, so it could vibrate. So that's where that resonance is actually coming from. In the proper completed version, which I haven't done a retake of the frequency response, I suspect you won't see this at all, and it'll look pretty much flat across there. There's a slight difference in the response, around 2 kilohertz, slightly more weak in the satellites. That might just be component tolerances. I'm not quite sure. Like, if this is basically the response of my floor standing monitors on their own. And this is measured at 50 centimeters, half a meter from the tweeter on tweeter axis, which is why you get this slight weakness here around the 20 hertz. It is producing content around there, but it's attenuated on it's attenuated by virtue of the fact that it's closer to the tweeter than it is to the woofer and the vent, substantially closer. The distance between and the 1 attenuation with distance, because it's 50 centimeters, basically a near field measurement. So you'll get a louder response coming from the tweeter simply by virtue that it's closer to that driver than the woofer and the vent. So at a greater distance, this will actually be lifted up. I wasn't really sure why you get this notch in here in the frequency response, but on thinking about it, it suddenly made a lot of sense to me, and I can explain it this way, because again, it's got to do with the piston operating range of a loudspeaker. So if you look at the frequency response of a typical, say, like in my case, the woofer mid-range, in an idealized sense, it might look something like this, and then, I don't know, something like that. And then if you actually looked at the electrical response, like where the self-inductance of the voice coil comes in, so the electrical response would probably be something like this. And the reason why, like, actually the cutoff's a bit too steep there. Something like that. You get this first order roll off at high frequencies electrically because of the self-inductance of the voice coil. But the reason why you don't actually see that in the output of the driver, even if it's a flatter one, the reason why it actually continues on above this electrical cutoff is because the driver is breaking up. What do you mean by breaking up? It isn't operating such that it's a solid body. It's not a solid body. It's got modal patterns going on. So basically, there's two ranges. There's one, the so-called piston operating range, where it appears like a piston, so it's a solid body. Nothing bends, and then beyond that, it starts breaking up, and you get these modal patterns on the cone. So essentially, what then happens is, say that's your cone. You get regions of positive, negative, positive, negative. Oh, sorry, that's negative. You get these modal patterns. Like if you've ever seen somebody like a luthier who takes the soundboard of an instrument they're constructing, they put a speaker behind it and sprinkle sand on it. You get these line patterns on there representing the nodes in the modal patterns. That's because the thing's not a solid object. So you'd get modal patterns likewise on a cone when it's in the breakup region, not the piston operating region. And basically, because you've got these regions where you've got, say, a positive and a negative, they tend to cancel out. So if you've got two positives and one negative, you essentially get a value of 1, right? And then alternatively, you can have, say a region of 2 negatives and 1 positive. And as you increase frequency, you get more and more of these. So you can see that because depending on how many positive regions and negative regions you get, you can either have the phase response being in phase or 180 degrees out of phase. And that's what you end up getting in here. So you get these notches because it's switching between modal patterns where you've got more positive than you have negative and more negative than you got positive. So you get these phase reversals because it's in the breakup region of the driver, not the piston operating region of the driver. So that's why you get this notch cancellation occurring. It's not because there's a fundamentally something wrong with the cabinet design or the crossover design. It's because the crossover assumed that the driver has a perfectly rigid response and doesn't have this breakup occurring, but in reality it does. So you get these notches occurring, and that's why it actually occurs at the top side of the crossover point, because the crossover is around about 1 kilohertz. So it occurs at the top side because that's when you've got significant content from the tweeter, which is actually operating in its piston operating region, so it doesn't have the phase reversals, and the mid-range, or woofer mid-range, which does have the phase reversals. It doesn't show up so much in this region below the crossover, because the crossover is attenuating the tweeter response, and as such, there's nothing for the phase cancellation to occur. At least that's my theory as to why that shows up. But as you can see, it extends to 20 kilohertz nicely, and it goes beyond, so it's pretty uniform. Then again, if we go on to that is actually my satellite. So it's slightly worse here in terms of that cancellation. Go away. I'm not sure why that is. It may be the component values in the crossover are slightly different in that implementation, because I couldn't get the same components because I bought them from a local supplier, and to buy them from the US in Trump's US, Trump's America would have cost me like as much money as the components would in freight to get them here. So I just thought, no, I'm not going to do that. That's a waste of money. It's the amount of freight, the freight charges from stuff from America is just amazing at the moment. It's just highway robbery. I don't understand how it's that expensive. It was like $500 or something. It's just absurd. But anyway, so that pretty much matches. And then if you look at the polar responses, this is showing a 60-degree off-axis on the horizontal plane, what the response of the driver looks like. So that crossover point is behaving pretty much the same, and you get the high-frequency roll-off, but there's nothing that looks particularly untoward. So the mid-range behavior is pretty much the same off-axis. That's going off-axis at 30 degrees. The other one was 60. So again, mid-range behavior is pretty much the same, and it's just rolling off at the top in a nice uniform fashion. This is in the vertical plane, so this is going negative in the vertical plane, 30 degrees off axis. Again, it's very uniform here, and the same sort of roll-off. And I don't seem to, well, that shows a picture of me actually doing a 60-degree off-axis in the vertical plane, minus 60 degree in the vertical plane measurement there with my measurement microphone. I don't seem to have a 60-degree, there's one image that I don't seem to have here, but the upshot of all that is, the upshot of all that is if you look at the behavior of the polar response of those satellite speakers and my main monitors going off axis in both directions, the behavior is very similar. So it's almost acting like a point source, which is what it should be. Not, I wouldn't say point source is not the right word. It's not a point source, but it has uniform behavior, relatively uniform behavior in both planes, both horizontal and vertical. In a less sophisticated crossover, you would typically get notching, deep notching in the vertical plane because you're basically, again, I can demonstrate that. So, that's interesting. Don't know where I put my cap. Yeah, so in the vertical plane, for instance, because you've got non-coherent sources, you've got, say, a speaker here, and you've got a speaker here. So if you go off-axis, say, in the far field, when they're summing together, you've got this distance. No, I didn't quite draw it lined up right. This distance, different distance in propagation, which results in a time difference between those two. So you tend to end up with an interference pattern.